Chapter 8. Jude ran through her words again. This didn't make any sense. He wasn't anyone important. I'm sorry, I'm not following. Why are you asking me for help? You know Beck is my brother, why not go directly to him? For that matter, why can't you go to your council? Sela pushed her multicolored hair over her shoulder. The council is aware of the problem with the witch, and their hands are as tied as ours. Several years ago, a man befriended our pack, and then he took our mates from us. As a warning to the pack, he killed my son. If we wanted to see our mates again, we'd do what he commanded. He controls when and how we see our families. If we fail him, our mates are the ones who suffer the consequences. So you see, if we went to a local Iowan agent, then our mates would be forfeit, murdered. You're not able to get them back? Werewolves were feared, at least from what Jude heard from Beck and Diego. What kind of force would it take to split up a pack? How much stronger would someone have to be to cower the werewolves and keep them at bay? We've tried. He moves them often and never to the same place twice. He used his magic to trap a demon to guard his ransom. We cannot find anyone who is as strong as the witch or who is willing to go against him. Sela paused, anguish coloring her words. We have tried everything and our families have suffered. Our mates are our only balance. Otherwise we come apart. My pack is unraveling. Friends and family are going rogue at a much faster rate than they should. I have unmated who are dropping dead for no reason. Last month I had to put down a mated male. That should have never happened. Sela swiped at a stray tear and went on. A couple of weeks ago I crossed paths with an urban shaman. He said the bones told of a man who would rise to power and challenge the witch. Unfortunately, I cannot wait for this stranger, this champion. We need our family back now. She straightened in her seat, drawing her shoulders back. I ask for your help because my wolves respect Diego Hernandez, but we can't be seen speaking with him. You're unknown to those who watch us. I hoped you'd agree to speak to Diego for us. Since Ulrich has shown an interest in you, everyone believes I authorized him to pursue you as a mate. Jude released a loud breath. So they needed help from Diego and Beck, not him. Specifically, no one knows you wanted to speak to me personally? No. It is best we kept it that way for now. Since you've seemed to return Ulrich's interest, they won't think anything about you being among us. But I wonder. Sela glanced at the door and then at Levi. I'm aware of the circumstances of their turning. The bulletins the council received from Iowan carried the description of a rogue matching the description Bertel gave. Bertel is one of the few who can recall their former lives, and I know he recounted what he remembered to the Iowan agent who relocated him, and Ulrich is known to move quickly against those who break the law. The risk to the human population alone means Iowan doesn't give up on a hunt, but it has been over a year. If he'd been found and killed, Iowan would have notified the council so we wouldn't worry about the rogue returning. For Bertel and Ulrich, that they haven't, and the length of time since the incident makes me wonder if the rogue is working with someone. I cannot bring our situation directly to Iowan because I don't trust they would help us. Is whispered Diego Hernandez has faced and defied the witch. Jude shivered. Beck had told him about the witch who'd been stalking Diego's family, taking Diego's older brother Hector. Before Jude had come to live with Beck, Diego had confronted the Bruja Blanco. At the time, Jude hadn't believed Beck's far-fetched story of how Diego disarmed and incapacitated the thugs guarding the witch. Since then, he'd come to believe Diego was as dangerous as Beck claimed. If the witch Diego sought to bring down was the same one holding the werewolves in a type of slavery. She studied Levi, her eyes narrowed as she thought. If what Bertel believes is correct and Ulrich was targeted believing they'd killed the druids shield. Sela's glacial eyes snapped to Jude. Wonder and then excitement filled her expression. The longer she stared, the more uneasy Jude became. The druid shield is important to us werewolves. Tomorrow I want you to go with Tasha to see the urban shaman. She stood up, obviously done with the conversation. Jude wasn't. Why is the druid shield important, and what does it have to do with Levi? Why do I need to go see a shaman? And why can't Levi take me to see the shaman? Don't use that name among anyone else, Sela snapped. If they think he is dead, then he won't be in danger. I don't understand. He was in a world he couldn't quite figure out yet. He needed a better explanation. Levi was meant to die. Sela said in a matter-of-fact tone. If those who desired his death found out he's alive, then they'll send others to kill him. Do you get it now? He was killed because someone believed he's the shield. You don't know werewolf lore, so you cannot perceive how important he is, but a more detailed explanation will have to wait. We need to leave the city before dusk settles and we change. The sooner we are gone, the better. That still doesn't explain why he can't take me to the shaman. Jude had never been so aggravated by his lack of knowledge. He thought he might have pushed too hard because Sela's patient smile looked strained. The 3 nights of the full moon my werewolves are at their strongest. The 3 days of the full moon they're at their weakest. Ulrich will be in no shape to move from his bed tomorrow, much less protect you. Stunned, Jude watched Sela walk out of the medical center. Why would Levi be target? If his werewolf was vulnerable, Jude didn't want to leave him behind. To see a shaman. What in the world did a shaman do anyway? Running a hand along his utility belt, he wondered if he should beg for more hardware from Diego. Accepting a thigh-length quilted leather coat from Levi, Jude shrugged into the jacket before following Levi out of the clinic. The building housing the werewolves was an old warehouse. The pack had cleaned the living areas used by the families, but something sucked at Jude's soul when he took in the rest of the dingy space with its boarded-up windows and dark, grease-layered beams. You live here full-time? He asked, finding it hard to believe they were stuck in such a dump. Tasha had said the werewolves were poor, but this wasn't simply poor. This existence was destitute. This is where the witch allows us to live, Levi answered evenly, his mouth pulled down in a fierce frown. In the main area there were several things he immediately noticed. He didn't see any children and only a handful of women. The rest of the inhabitants were male. The absence of the mates, a critical part of the pack, and the cause of their imbalance was tangible. Taking a quick head count, he came up with 43 people. Is this everyone? Jude whispered. Yes. He has the others. Do you feel it? Bertel sighed heavily. He did, when it shouldn't have been possible. Jude wasn't a werewolf, but he could swear he was connected to them somehow. His frown deepened as his gaze swept over the people again. It's a gaping hole, a wound. Is it a pack thing? How I can feel their pain. A faint smile ghosted across Bertel's lips. You could say that, but I don't know why you sense the imbalance. Jude met Bertel's considering glance, but Bertel said nothing more. An emotional agony hung about the pack like a thick, heavy cloak. The closer Jude came to the group, the more it seemed as if he swam through a dense cloud. Was the sorrow solely caused by the missing family members? Jude didn't understand. Was this knowing the way he was able to sense their utter desolation, a mental or spiritual connection with the wolves? Where did the knowing come from? He just reconnected with Levi, but as amazing as being scent marked by Levi had been, that action alone wouldn't create this almost tangible bond to the pack. Jude had a hard time making himself believe it was possible, but neither could he explain how this closeness came about. As if they were one entity, the werewolves lifted their heads and scented the air. Wild gazes fell upon him. A sea of arctic blue eyes filled with unspoken pain. Jude's heart thumped in his chest as they stirred and moved his way. He widened his stance and pushed the coat back so he could place his hand casually on his utility belt. Every single warning Beck had given him regarding werewolves whispered in his ear. He briefly wondered what the hell he thought he was doing when Levi's hand snaked beneath his bent arm, landing on his torso. Lifting the hem of Jude's shirt, Levi's large palm rested possessively against his abdomen. With a nudge, Levi encouraged Jude to lean against his broad chest while his thumb rubbed against his skin. From Bertel and Sela's comments, Jude knew Levi's scent clung to him, but exposing his belly to the werewolf seemed counterintuitive. Placing his trust in Levi, Jude relaxed. If mated pairs brought stability to the pack, then missing mates brought instability. If the 6 women represented the mates, then the ratio of mated to unmated was too wide. How could they even operate and stay sane? Then Jude recalled Sela's words about having to put down a mated male. By simply being able to feel the pack, Jude came to understand what Sela spoke of earlier, and wondered what she thought Diego could do for them. Not wishing to add to their distress, Jude gradually melted back into Levi. Grateful for the comfort of the arms holding him, boldly he held out his hand. In greeting, the pack circled and sniffed, growls punctuated by hopeful whines. As they came closer, Levi made happy rumbling noises the pack responded to. When the first werewolf accepted his hand, it was a signal, and multiple people touched him at once. With every brush, pat, and handshake, the werewolves took something from him. Jude wasn't hurt or even alarmed, because the more he concentrated on what was happening, the more he understood he gave them something important. A soft, calming essence surrounded him and Levi. He wasn't sure how, but he found he could push it out, and the effect was immediate. The palpable sense of sorrow lessened as the tension among the werewolves diminished, replaced by timid smiles. Jude prolonged the contact with the wolves he sensed were more damaged, willingly giving in to the strong desire to help. Seela watched the reception from the sidelines along with the human women. A knowing smile brightened her expression. A couple of the female mates cried openly, hands over mouths, holding on to each other. Jude had never been able to stand to see a woman cry. He detached himself from Levi's grasp, and even though they were complete strangers, he greeted them with a warm embrace. With tear-stained smiles and affectionate kisses, the women whispered heartfelt words of welcome. Only with Diego's family had he ever felt this connected or accepted by people. As he continued to greet the pack, he wondered how anyone could turn these people down. How could others not see their torment or even fear them? Were the packs judged solely by the actions of the rogues? Tasha appeared at one of the many doorways holding a boy of perhaps 2 or 3 years old. Jude was never a good judge of children's ages. The child had the pack's black hair streaked with white and gray along with the Arctic blue eyes. His small head rested on Tasha's shoulder, but he gazed intently at Jude. "Where are the other children?" he asked Seela. "The witch has them. We've been able to hide Brandon. Tasha was a couple months pregnant when the witch executed my son." Seela's voice held a bitter edge. Jude quickly connected the dots, understanding that Tasha had been the mate to the pack's future alpha. Judging by the power coming off the child, similar to what Jude felt from Seela, he intuitively understood the boy would take his father's place as next in line. As soon as Tasha was close, the child leaned toward Jude, arms outstretched in the classic hold me please gesture. Tentatively he took the child, and Brandon immediately snuggled into his chest. A hair-raising growl pulled Jude's attention to Dallin, who stood on the outskirts of the pack. "You allow the potential mate of a changed one to touch our future leader." Dallin spat the word changed one as if the description was dirty and offensive. Many in the pack flinched, some growling back. "Don't press your luck," Seela warned. "You know we don't abide by such prejudice, Dallin. Changed ones are not pack. They're weak. They can't handle their wolf and have to be put down like rabid dogs. The only thing they've done is give werewolves a reputation we don't deserve. Now not only do we have 2, but that one's filthy mate." Dallin snorted and spit a glob of snot on the ground at Jude's feet. "Is tainting our future alpha with his touch." Dallin stabbed a finger in Levi's direction. Seela moved faster than Jude's eyes could track and appeared in front of Dallin. Her teeth were bared, long canines lengthening as Jude watched. "Do you wish to challenge me again? Is your ego not bruised enough, or do you enjoy the pain I can dish out?" Dallin averted his eyes and bared his neck to her, slowly kneeling and then lying on his back, showing Seela his belly. His fear of her was evident, which only confused Jude further. He'd been told Dallin pushed the pack laws. Why? When it was obvious he couldn't take Seela's place. Power rolled off both Brandon and Seela. It was plainly obvious they were alphas, the strongest among the pack. Levi, Bertel, and a couple others had a force of strength about them, but nothing near Seela's. Jude assumed that made them seconds to the alpha. Did Tasha say something about enforcers? Would that be the same status of those who had lesser power than the leaders? On the other hand, there was Dallin. Now that Jude saw him among the rest of the pack, Dallin seemed to fall somewhere in the middle of the remaining members. When compared to Seela, Dallin wasn't intimidating in the least. Jude's lack of knowledge aggravated him more because he couldn't surmise Dallin's motivation for causing Seela trouble. From what Tasha said, pack members helped each other, and he sensed they shared their sorrow. Why then would Dallin willingly add more hardship to their burden? It made no sense, but he realized it wasn't a puzzle he'd piece together soon. "Everyone ready?" Seela asked, still staring down at Dallin in his submissive pose. "Yes, Seela." One of the werewolves answered. Let's pack up the essentials. The vehicles have been fueled. Dallin, you're driving the bus. Bertel, take 2 men and you'll be in charge of the forward SUV. Ulrich, you're in charge of the rear transport. Everyone hustle. We are running behind. Dusk falls in a few hours and we haven't left for the moon lands yet. Let's go. At Sela's barked command, everyone dispersed. Jude met Dallin's hate-filled stare, but he noticed Dallin's glance softened when falling on Tasha or her son. What had he done to earn such looks of naked disgust from Dallin? Gripping the edge of the utility belt with his free hand, Jude wondered if he'd be using the baton sooner rather than later. Choosing to ignore Dallin, Jude cuddled Brandon closer and glanced at his watch, surprised at how much time had passed. He followed the crowd out of the warehouse to an old parking lot. There were about 10 various types of vehicles and a large tour bus hidden behind the buildings. Stopping in front of the bus, Tasha held her hands out to Brandon. Jude carefully handed him over, gently plucking at the small fists that gripped his jacket. Brandon whimpered and wiggled, leaning towards Jude with his chubby arms outstretched. Instead of distress, Tasha flashed Jude one of her bright smiles as if Brandon's behavior pleased her. Ulrich will want you with him. Congratulations on your mating, Jude. The pack is grateful to the strength you've added to our family. Reaching up on tiptoe, she kissed his cheek. Over her head he caught a glimpse of Dallin watching, murder in his expression as he stared at Jude. He didn't care what Dallin's problem was, but Jude refused to back down from the rising threat of violence coming from the troublesome werewolf. Dallin, Sela snapped, coming up behind Jude. You're supposed to be on the bus. Everyone's boarded but you. Dallin startled, his expression sheepish for a split second. Sela climbed on board the vehicle behind Dallin and closed the door. Levi pulled Jude along to a dark SUV where 2 other werewolves waited. What was he going to do on the pack's moonlands? He should say goodbye and tell Levi he'd come back in 3 days. With everything that had happened, he'd forgotten to borrow Sela's phone. Beck was going to kick his ass all over the city for making him worry, but when Jude turned and met Levi's gaze, he was reluctant to leave just yet. He glanced back to the bus. Perhaps there was still time to ask, but he hesitated, remembering Sela's distrust and suspicion of Iwan and her fear of the witch. In a short period of time he discovered he'd become just as paranoid. Would the witch be keeping tabs on who the pack called? He'd always thought call tracking in the TV shows was a bunch of dramatized bullshit, but now he was aware Iwan could do such and he wasn't willing to bet the lives of the people he just met on his belief the witch couldn't or wouldn't watch the pack that closely. If he was wrong, someone would be hurt and the witch would know an Iowan agent had been contacted. Jude walked to the rear vehicle where Levi and 2 other werewolves waited. He talked to Sela to find out how the witch kept track of them. Fall else failed, when Tasha took him to the shaman tomorrow, he'd buy a disposable phone to call his brother, which led to a whole other set of issues because Sela suspected someone at Iwan was covering up for the rogue. At least that was how he read her reaction. Beck had insinuated a couple of times Diego sometimes worked outside Iwan's guidelines, and Jude had to wonder if Sela knew and if that was her reason for wanting Diego's help. He smiled for Levi before climbing into the passenger seat. The longer he thought about the situation, the more questions he had, and they were giving him a headache. As they brought up the rear of the little convoy, Levi explained they were headed to a secluded tract of land on the Anza Borrego State Park. Within the mountains, they maintained a lodge where they spent the 3 days of the full moon. What does Sela mean when she says that in the daytime you're at your weakest? Jude glanced behind him at the 2 werewolves in the middle seat. They stared at him, faces stretched into eerily happy grins. The change starts before the nightfall. In the morning we're exhausted, sleeping the day away. We are at our most vulnerable in the daytime because some of us cannot be roused from sleep, and if we are awake we're lethargic and slow to respond. Our bodies are weak, recouping from transformation. We rely heavily on the mates to see to our safety. Jude stared out the window, running everything he'd learned through his head. Mating helped stabilize the pack and calm the unmated werewolves. He glanced behind him again. The 2 men were still grinning at him. Is that why? He hooked a thumb over his shoulder. The werewolf Levi had introduced as Timothy cleared his throat. Yes and no. When Jude's lifted his brow, Timothy actually blushed. The witch allows 5. Mated couples in the pack. With our numbers, anything less would cause the pack to become too unstable and draw one's attention. We've been around mated pairs and have benefited from their stability. But you and Ulrich are different. Your energy isn't the same. The other werewolf nodded his agreement. The longer you're around, the better I feel, Timothy explained. In fact, I haven't felt this good in years. I don't understand it, but I'm not going to complain. So me coming along is a good thing? Jude teased. Oh yes, a very good thing. Levi's grin promised wicked things. Once Jude thought about it, the energy coming off the 2 werewolves was different from before. The sorrow and desolation had diminished and now joy emanated from the 2. He was confused as to why that was. Sensing them felt odd and familiar at the same time, but he couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation why his presence would provide more ease, especially when he and Levi weren't mated. Nor could he explain away the way he felt around the werewolves, as if he was finally where he wanted to be, until he discovered why. He would watch and learn. Sela barks orders as if she's been in the military. Jude thought back how the pack had snapped to when she'd ushered them from the warehouse. Timothy frowned. After Sela's alpha mate was taken, she was challenged by a few changed ones. They weren't raised in a pack and didn't understand the strength in our leaders wasn't the only attribute we needed. Before the witch uprooted us from our lands, our pack functioned more like a family unit. The pack alphas used to be leaders, but not the same as what Sela has had to become. The alpha pair are parents to the pack because they're the strongest. Our protectors. The witch has done much to take away the pack's ability to protect ourselves and our mates. Now he uses us as his personal army thugs to threaten others when he wants to throw his weight around to prove how powerful he is. We've had to adapt in order to stay alive. The family structure had to be put aside because too many looked at it and thought Sela was weak. The council sent a human who'd been living with another pack to help us. How the pack was managed changed. We don't like it, but we know it is necessary. Levi pulled off the pavement onto a rutted gravel road. After a while they passed through a gate where Jude hopped out to close the chain-link gate, securing the barrier with a padlock. The sign designated the area as a restricted rangers road. Once parked, they still trekked a path up the mountainside. The werewolves presented more signs of transformation in the shape of their faces and body posture. Jude found it odd to watch the men growl and snap and play more wolf than man. Whether by accident or design, the pack circled around him and Levi. Their exuberance was catching, causing Jude to laugh at their antics. They went out of their way to entice him to play with them. He noticed Sela closely observing them, especially as he interacted with her pack. He guessed it could be an alpha thing, but for some reason he sensed she watched him for an altogether different reason. Halfway up the trail, Tasha's son insisted Jude carry him again. He was alarmed to see Brandon exhibited signs of the change as well. It had never occurred to him the children would be a slave to the moon too. They reached a clearing that held a replica of a Viking longhouse. Indoors was a single space with low beds lining the walls, and an open fire pit was in the center of the room. At the far end were a couple of bathrooms and a serviceable kitchen. Everyone split off from the group, claiming space and dropping bags at the foot of beds. The women went around, closed the blinds on the windows, and started a fire. The mountain air had taken on a cool quality as the sun neared the western horizon. Moving around in the higher altitude, Jude found it increasingly harder to breathe. Tasha noticed and pushed him into a chair, handing him a bottle of water. You'll get used to the height. Until then, no roughhousing, she teased. Seriously, no running or anything too strenuous until your body becomes accustomed to the altitude. Patting him on the shoulder, Tasha left him to his own devices. Brandon climbed onto Jude's lap, and together they watched the pack settle until Tasha came back and claimed Brandon again. The werewolves moved more slowly as the day progressed. They eventually stripped out of their clothes and found a place to settle around the pit fire. Jude was surprised he actually sensed their level of physical discomfort increased the closer dusk became. Taking a seat next to Levi, Jude lightly stroked a hand down Levi's back. His body hair thickened and lengthened and his face elongated to a snout tipped with a square black nose. Canines peeked from between thinning lips, causing Levi to lisp. their light conversation taking on a guttural edge, punctuated by heavy panting until Levi could no longer speak. A half hour before sundown, the werewolves laid on the floor, soft whines, the only verbalization they were able to give to their pain as bones began to move and lengthen. One of the mates, Sarah, stood and began to sing to the werewolves in a perfect alto. Her voice lilted over the words as she walked around, giving a soothing touch here and there. She sang of hearth and home, of high green pastures rich with game. She sang of love and life and family, the clear tone of her voice filling the longhouse to the rafters. Vehemently wishing he could wipe away Levi's pain, Jude continued to stroke Levi's furred back lightly. It was easy to see the song eased the wolves' tension. Agony was stamped on Levi's features, punctuated by the sound of bones snapping out of joints. Bushy tails grew from the bottom of their spines and body mass doubled. Grunts of distress filled the air around Jude, as those caught in the throes of change began to writhe on the ground, no longer able to stay still through the growth from human to wolfman. After the sky became completely dark, the werewolves' transition completed. They lay curled into tight balls on the floor, soft whimpers issuing from mouths that no longer formed human words. Jude held Levi's head in his lap, stroking the surprisingly soft brown pelt. He glanced around the room. Bertel's silvery white fur stood out among the sea of black and gray of the born werewolves. One by one they stirred, shaking their bodies from the head to the tip of the tails as if sloughing off the aches and pains of the last 3 hours. Their sheer size astounded Jude. His skin prickled at the thought of being prey, pursued by such creatures. He'd thought being chased by werewolves in their human form had been harrowing. That was child's play compared to the forms around him now. The werewolves milled about by the double doors. Some stood on 2 limbs while others rested on 4. They calmly waited for all the members of the pack before they headed outside together as one unit. Their voices lifted in hunting howls raised the hair on the back of Jude's neck. He followed behind them until he reached the doorway. The werewolves melted into the forest surrounding the longhouse. Dallin lunged and snapped at Jude as he went by, causing Jude to jump back. Levi tackled Dallin and the two rolled away in a tangle of limbs and snarls. Dallin extracted himself when they rolled to a stop and raced away with Levi and Bertel hot on his heels. A soft hand on his arm stopped Jude from following. Let them work it out, Tasha replied at his questioning glance. Won't they hurt each other? Even though Levi was one of the stronger members of the pack, Jude still worried about his welfare. Dallin had ambushed Levi with followers last time they'd had a confrontation. What would keep Dallin from doing so again? Possibly, but they'll have to work it out between them. Ulrich is driven to safeguard you. He wants you as his mate, and Dallin will test the boundaries of Ulrich's resolve. Sela will keep them from doing any lasting harm. Jude wasn't reassured. He'd rather be out there guarding Levi's back. With nothing to do, Jude dozed. It was surreal to be awakened by a wet dog smell and saliva-rich wolfy licks. Cracking an eyelid, he spied Levi crouched, hovering over him with his snout mere inches from Jude's face. Levi's head cocked to the side as if he waited for Jude to do something. Behind Levi's crouched werewolf form, his long fluffy tail became a blur of happiness. What's up? Jude mumbled, running his tongue over his teeth to dislodge the cottonmouth fuzz. A bright neon green soccer ball landed on Jude's chest. Even though Levi couldn't answer, a light of excitement shone in Levi's eyes. Seriously? Wolves in the wild don't play catch. Levi nudged the ball with the back of his hairy knuckles, the motion clearly insistent. Crawling out of the sleeping pallet, Jude dressed. The only other werewolves in the longhouse were the ones with their mates. Why do they get to cuddle and I have to go out into the cold? Jude groused. Levi chuffed, bouncing from foot to foot, his eyes on the ball. Jude stared, for a moment marveling at how anyone could find the werewolves frightening. Here Levi was in his wolfman form, his body covered in hair, pointed ears swiveling even as those large green eyes stayed trained onto Jude. Perhaps he was seeing a different side to the pack. He'd freely admit his initial meeting with the werewolves on the parkour run had scared him, but since spending time with them he'd come to see how misunderstood they were. Levi followed him outside where Jude tossed the soccer ball. He watched in fascination as Levi caught the ball without puncturing the hide with his sharp nails and brought the ball back to Jude. Anything smaller would have been difficult for Levi to handle with ease. Jude laughed and tossed the ball in, the air deftly handling it. Several werewolves wandered over to see what they were up to. Some became just as excited as Levi at the sight of the soccer ball. Do you know how weird this is? Jude asked. Levi grinned, baring a row of sharp teeth. Running out a distance, Levi waited for Jude to throw the ball, and he immediately tossed it back. Jude's breath caught, and it took him a moment to throw again. They used to spend hours playing catch when they were younger. Jude made himself breathe through the excitement and sorrow. Was it the same? No, it would never be the same. After a while, the other werewolves approached, and Jude included them in the game. Some played, some watched, and others tussled on the ground, wrestling and roughhousing like teenagers. Whatever Jude had expected of a pack of dangerous wolfmen, this wasn't it. Beck had spoken of werewolves like they were out of control, violent creatures with no true humanity. Jude had been told they were killers and not to be trusted. The wolfmen before him weren't any of those things. It pissed him off that such negative propaganda and lies had been spread about these people. He'd have a long conversation with his brother and possibly someone at Iowan. There was no reason for the lack of information on werewolves. He wouldn't allow them to continue to treat the werewolves disrespectfully. Maybe he should have been wary with the speed with which he'd adopted the pack as his own, especially in the face of how much he didn't know about them. Jude's acceptance was largely based on the energy he'd felt coming off the werewolf since he was first been introduced to the pack. From the corner of his eye, he glimpsed the glow his parents were convinced he'd made up. He wished he knew what the light meant. What he did understand came from what he sensed of them, his intuition. He trusted his instincts more than the second-hand information he'd been given. These people, this pack of werewolves, were his family, and some deep primal part of him whispered they were his too. Chapter 9. Jude woke the next morning in the very human arms of Levi. He'd rarely spent the night with Levi, but the sleepovers they'd had weren't sexual. Those youthful days were long gone and much different from the present. The possessive hand on his belly, the leg wedged in between his Jude grinned, the drool on his shoulder was a little odd, and yet exquisitely right. Extracting himself from Levi's embrace, he carefully crawled out of the sleeping pallet to tiptoe to the restroom. He passed a couple of the mates, waiting, hovering over the coffee machine, anticipating the black gold that would trickle forth. After taking a quick shower, he emerged in a billow of warm steam with a towel slung around his waist. Pulling clean clothes out of Levi's duffel, he was amused to see the selection was merely a variation of what he'd worn the day before. He grinned as he mulled over the obvious fact that Levi liked him in tight leather. Not that leather was a bad thing. Jude hadn't worn such before, and other than being on the warm side, the clothing was comfortable. In a way, Jude felt as if he donned an altered persona, a bit of hotness and a load of badassery. Certainly he felt a boost to his confidence, and it was hard not to add a hint of swagger to his step. Although this was not something he would wear to class. If he did, he imagined he would lose his anonymity, and the thought made him uncomfortable. He had no desire to be the center of attention. Just thinking about it made him feel exposed. By the time he went back to the kitchen, the line for coffee was gone. He gulped his cup, noticing how soundly the werewolves slept, barely moving at the loud noises the women made. When will they be up? Jude asked Tasha, who fed a drowsy Brandon. They'll start waking up between 2 and 5. Most can't be roused right now. The first night of the full moon is the most exhausting. The mates will spend the day preparing enough food to feed to them. When they wake, they'll be famished, and a huge meal will help fuel their bodies for tonight. Jude noticed the werewolves exhibited some telltale signs of their wolf being close to the surface. Prominent eye teeth, excessive hair. Non-pack friends who knew these men would definitely notice the difference because it was something they couldn't hide. Sela wanted me to take you to see the shaman. If you're finished with breakfast, we can leave now. Tasha rinsed out her cup and grabbed her purse. Jude popped the last piece of toast in his mouth and wiped his hands on his pants. Will this take long? We have to go back to the city. It depends on how quickly we find him, Tasha replied, grabbing her coat. What about Brandon? Jude asked. One of the mates took over supervising the boy. I can't take him out in public in case I'm being watched by the witch. He'd take Brandon from us. If he finds out Ulrich pursues you for a mate, then he'll Require one of the other mates to go with him. Yesterday Timothy warned me of the consequences. Jude followed her down the path to the lot where the vehicles were parked. I'm uncomfortable putting the other mates in danger of being separated. Jude had spent the night brooding over the control the witch held over the werewolves. How did one man gain so much power? How could Beck, oh, and not know? Given time, Jude knew he'd adore the pack as much as he loved the Hernandez family. He wasn't about to let a lone man hold those he cared about hostage. After the full moon had passed, he'd go to Beck and Diego. If need be, he'd beg for help for the werewolves. If he convinced them all wasn't as it seemed, he hoped Iowan would step in and put a stop to the stranglehold the witch had on the pack. Has Dallin always competed with Ulrich? I don't understand what he spat at Ulrich yesterday about being a changed one. All I know is what I've seen and heard outside the club. Dallin threatened to mate me against my will. Then his friend did his best to kill me. He was upset I held Brandon, and every fiber of my being tells me he'd do anything to make me leave. His actions don't make sense. Philip, the werewolf who harmed you, was arrested and placed in solitary confinement. Harming humans is strictly forbidden. He was sent to the council with written statements as soon as you were brought in that you lived will keep the council from putting him to death. Why harm me at all? I don't understand. Jude, you haven't been around werewolves for very long. The reception you received when you were introduced to the pack, I don't know how to explain it. I have never seen that happen in all of the years I've been with the pack. Jude couldn't help but laugh. You seem like you're barely older than I am. I'm sure there has to be other similar situations. Tasha giggled, her cheeks turning pink. I'll be 112 in about 6 weeks. Jude's brows rose to his hairline. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't. Wow, you look great. Tasha laughed harder. It's okay. So, Jude cleared his throat. If the pack has never accepted another as easily as they accepted me, what does that mean? Not only that, their demeanor changed as they interacted with you. I'm lost. I am too. I'm hoping the shaman can shed some light on their odd behavior. Tasha said softly, almost as if she spoke only to herself. First stop in town was the store where Jude bought a disposable phone. If he knew his brother at all, he bet a year's wages that Beck would be watching his phone. Since Jude's cell was destroyed, Beck wouldn't be able to track it, but he would tap into the incoming calls. He stood on the sidewalk, not yet crossing the parking lot to where Tasha waited patiently in the car. His gut churned acid at the thought of calling his brother directly. Beck would demand he come home now, and though Jude understood, he would refuse. He wanted more time to learn about the werewolves before he went home and talked Diego and Beck into helping them. With Beck's prejudice, he figured it would be an uphill battle and he would need every scrap of knowledge he could get. Jude punched in his old cell number, waiting while it rang for the voicemail to pick up. Hey, it's me. God, he felt silly leaving a message for himself, and more so for not identifying himself. Perhaps he was being overly cautious, but while he knew of the paranormal world, his brother and Diego policed it. He hadn't a clue what was and wasn't possible. I had a problem getting a phone. I had issues. I'm going to be staying with our friend for a couple days longer before I come home. Things got a little strange the other night. Speaking of which, if you see Steven, I hope he's okay. Actually, if you could call him for me. His number is on the refrigerator. Check on him, huh? Damn, it was hard leaving a message within a message while making it sound normal. Just check on him, please, and let him know I'll call him when I get home. Look, I know we don't see eye to eye on a couple of things, but I need you to be tolerant. There are people I would like to bring around. It's important to me. We need shit. I need to talk to Diego. Sorta need his help. Anyway. Love you, and I'll talk to you later. Tucking the phone into his pocket, Jude felt better. He knew the voicemail wouldn't get him out of trouble with Beck, but it was what he could do for now. He hoped that Beck would eventually understand. When he climbed into the car, he gave Tasha a wide smile. Everything all right? She asked. Jude nodded. Good. Next stop, shaman hunting. Tasha drove across town through increasingly tired neighborhoods and eventually parked the SUV near a deli, the only business that appeared to be operational on the block. Jude followed her, glancing around. The many Buildings were boarded up or had iron bars over the windows and doors. Trash was gathered against the walls, partially cluttering or blocking the broken sidewalk. Despite the state of the area, there were people on the streets. Jude didn't know why he believed that despite appearances most of the people around them weren't human. What he'd learned from Diego appeared to be only the tip of the iceberg. Sure, he identified the races he'd already been taught, but those were outnumbered by the others. The weird sense of otherness wasn't something he could easily pin down, just a feeling he had. He and Tasha were halfway down the block when Jude finally recognized what he was seeing. The people who passed by Jude, moving through his periphery, shone different colors. The effect was similar to what he'd seen around Diego, but not as bright nor the same type of light. Neither was the glow the same as that of the werewolves. There were oranges, reds, blues, greens, and purples. The colors were never the same from person to person, and not once had he seen so many people gathered in on location who had auras. Tasha stopped and opened the deli door, bringing Jude out of his reverie. The deli windows were so dingy the interior was cloudy and indistinct. Following Tasha through the doorway, the delicious aroma of hot hoagies and pizza made his stomach rumble in appreciation. Conversation halted, the room falling into silence as everyone turned their gaze upon Jude and Tasha. More than a couple of noses lifted into the air, visibly inhaling. Belatedly, Jude wondered if showering had been such a good idea. Had he washed off Levi's scent? Tasha greeted the pink-haired woman behind the counter. They weaved their way through the tables to the deli cabinet. Jude attempted to ignore the blatant stares of the patrons. Had he done something wrong? Did they dislike humans? Hey Stacy, Tasha replied. It's been a while. The woman behind the counter wore a skin-tight black t-shirt with the sleeves cut off. Tattoos of roses in every hue and size covered her arms. Her hair was long, severely straight, and the color of cotton candy. Heavy black eyeshadow surrounded eyes so purple they resembled gems. Black-lined lips quirked up in a smirk. How are you doing, baby girl? You finally find you a new man? Stacy inquired, eyeing Jude. Tasha giggled and blushed. No, this is a friend, Jude. We were hoping to see the shaman today. Has he been by? Stacy studied Jude for a moment longer. I can see why you would. I'm sure once he gets a whiff of that, he'll come to investigate. Take a seat. I'll bring you a couple of sandwiches. Tasha thanked Stacy while Jude attempted to check his clothes discreetly for body odor. Was Stacy making a joke at his expense? They found a free booth in the corner. Jude leaned in close to Tasha and whispered, "What is the shaman supposed to smell?" Tasha regarded him for a moment. "I'm not sure," she replied. "If I had to guess, I'd say you. I stink? Why didn't you tell me when we left the cabin?" Jude hissed in mock mortification. A grin ghosted across Tasha's lips. Not that kind of smell. She paused. Her hands moved in front of her in a circle. I think you realize most of the people here are paranormals. Jude nodded. Some of them can scent otherness in individuals. Before he could ask what she meant, Stacy brought over 2 huge sandwiches, next to a heaping side of fries and coleslaw. His mouth watered. All thought of questioning Tasha further was derailed by the unparalleled aroma of the food, causing him to think of nothing but his empty belly and filling it. He dove into the meal with unaccustomed gusto and a single-mindedness he hadn't had since he went through his last growth spurt. When Jude was dusting off the last of the fries that were pure heaven, Stacy returned and filled his glass with iced tea. I thought you might have needed that. Stacy gave Jude an exaggerated wink. Tasha, make sure you ask the shaman about diet. This boy was starving. He's probably been eating, but not what he's needed. Will do, Stacy. Thanks. What do I owe you for the meals? On the house, honey. It's not every day a simple gal like me gets to meet a newborn. She inhaled, a dreamy expression crossing her face. He's going to be a strong one too. It's about time the werewolves. Stacy inhaled deeply and chuckled. Yeah, change is coming. About damn time. Jude frowned. Newborn? Was she referring to his new ability to heal fast or something else? Strong one. He had his ass kicked a couple days ago, so she couldn't mean physical strength. What else was there to be strong in? Perhaps strong-willed. Beck would agree with that one. Jude hated he was clueless as to what she talked about, but he was reluctant to show his ignorance. Instead, He turned his attention to her last statement. Change? What kind of change? Stacy only smiled, clapping Jude on the back as she moved away. On her way across the room, she started a jaunty whistle. The sound was haunting and compelling. As he studied her, Jude noticed for the first time the deli, which had only been half full when he and Tasha entered, was now filled to capacity plus some. For every person who discreetly watching him, there was one who stared openly. What the hell was going on? Jude didn't feel threatened or intimidated, but more like a bug under a microscope. The door opened again, and in walked a teenager wearing low-riding jeans and a neon blue hoodie zipped all the way up. The room fell into a hush as everyone watched the kid scan the room. He stopped at Jude and cocked his head, a lock of his dark spiky hair falling over one eye. What are you waiting for? Hurry up. Jude blinked and glanced to Tasha for direction. She rose from the booth. He scrambled to follow, confused and starting to become more than merely annoyed. Since meeting the pack, it seemed people acted strangely around him. Was this going to become a common occurrence? Where are we going? Jude asked once they'd stepped out of the deli. The kid looked at Jude as if he were stupid. You wanted to see the shaman. I'm the one who'll take you. Pursing his lips, Jude crushed any questions he thought of voicing. He gripped his utility belt, checking his collapsible batons as the neighborhood they entered became progressively worse. People stopped and watched them go by. First, he thought it was because he was human and in a part of town that was definitely paranormal. But the longer he spent on the street, the more he believed the reason was something else. Outside what appeared to be an abandoned apartment building, the boy knocked on the metal door. Good luck. The teenager gave a two-fingered wave and vanished. What the fuck? Jude exclaimed, turning in circles looking for the prankster. Tasha twisted the handle and the door easily opened. Come on, Jude. She grabbed his coat sleeve and pulled him in after her. What met Jude's eyes wasn't what he'd expected. Outside he'd thought the building was an apartment complex, but the inside was one large, complete home. Next to the front door stood a coat rack. On the other side of the doorway a pile of shoes sat next to a tall wicker basket that held canes, umbrellas and strangely a sword. The bookshelves lining the walls were packed full and took up every available wall space. The floors were comprised of rich, dark woods and expensive oriental rugs. The space was open and airy, with defined seating areas and a small kitchen. Jude glanced overhead into an eerie inky darkness instead of a typical ceiling. A door opened across the way and a tall, gangly man whose age appeared anywhere between 30 and 50 entered the room. He halted when he sighted Tasha and Jude standing in the entryway. The man's hair was so red Jude would have thought the color fake if the eyebrows and goatee hadn't matched the color to a T. A black turtleneck and leather pants made the hair color that much more shocking. Bright green eyes stared expressionlessly at Jude. He was agitated that once again he was being ogled. What? He snapped. What is so wrong with me to make people gawk so rudely? Sela never said if the shaman was a man or a woman. Was this who he was supposed to meet or an assistant? Did more than one person live there? Jude had never met a shaman before and assumed they would wear something or have a bearing that clearly said he was facing a holy man. The man didn't reply. Jude ran a shaky hand through his blonde locks and barely refrained from pulling them. What was wrong with him? Why was his temper so close to the surface? He glanced back at the basket. Had the weapon moved? The leather-wrapped handle of the sword now leaned toward him. Jude returned his attention to the redhead and tried for civility. Look, we're sorry to bother you. We're looking for the shaman. Are you him? If not, do you know where we can find him? What do you want with the shaman? The man had a slight accent. Something niggled at Jude's memory he couldn't quite grasp. Sela, Alpha of the Arctic Pack of Mercury, said I should talk to him. Her? Sela the werewolf, the redhead sneered. Why would the werewolf send a boy to see the shaman? He has more important things to do than play fetch with a pack of fleabags. Jude gritted through his rising anger. This prick had the gall to speak of the pack in such a way. Tasha stood next to him, her head down and shoulders hunched. Sela said the shaman could assist them. If he had to eat a little crow to help the werewolves get their mates back, he would. Jude breathed a couple more times before he replied. Look, I don't want to take up more of the shaman's time than I have to. A witch is holding their mates captive and… Ah! The prick interrupted. A witch? That's what she told you? A witch. Witch indeed. The White Witches who has trapped the werewolves. Not just the Mercury pack. He controls all the packs. Their lives are held in his hands. Red smirked at Jude. His mind reeled with the potential number of werewolves that one lone man had control over. The number of people he had kidnapped. What the hell? Why hasn't anyone helped them? How could they allow one person with that much power to go unchecked? Who wants to cross Mark's Barnabas? Red laughed bitterly at the expression on Jude's face. I see you know of him. That's something at least. You're not completely stupid. It doesn't matter who he is, Jude argued. No one should be allowed to abuse others. I take it back. You're a box of rocks. The werewolves have made their bed. The dogs didn't guard their sverd skjold. They'd forgotten what life was like for wolfkind with the sword and shield. They deserve their fate. The man's alabaster skin flushed a brilliant red, the color telling Jude the depth of his anger. Sverd. A husky male voice rife with anguish whispered over and over in Jude's head. The word meant something. The voice, he knew the voice, and yet, when he tried to remember from where, he ran into a blank wall of nothing. A dull, pounding headache started in his temple. How can you say that? No one deserves to be taken from their homes to have their family used as leverage for obedience or to fear that one wrong move would mean the torture of the innocent. That's not justice. Jude yelled the last sentence, his fury getting away from him. And what? You're going to be the one to save the pack of dogs? Stupid boy. Werewolves are mongrels pretending to be humans. All they know is violence. Maybe they should be exterminated. Humans won't have to mate with them or worry about being turned into one. Werewolves' actions grow worse with every passing year. The stability within the pack is questionable. It's no wonder humans gather to hunt them. They bring unwanted attention to us paranormals. Jude had had enough of the man's vile hatred. He drew a quietly sobbing Tasha into his arms, soothing back her pixie-ish hair. He'd find another way to locate the mates and help the werewolves. There had to be others who cared. Weren't shamans supposed to be healers and spiritual people? It was a crock of shit. If anyone asked him, come on Tasha, we'll find another way. Asshole, Jude spat. The man snorted and sneered. What? You're going to save the werewolves? Yes. Jude snapped with barely controlled fury. With or without help. Red grabbed a rod off the table nearest to him and charged. Jude swung Tasha behind him onto the floor near the door where he grasped the handle of the sword from the wicker basket. The sharp sting of electricity jumped into Jude's palm as he drew the blade. The sword met and shattered the wooden rod mere inches before the staff would have slammed into Jude's head. He'd heard more than enough bile from the pompous asshole, body humming like a tuning rod. Something bound within broke free in a warm rush. Jude kicked Red in the chest with the hard sole of his biker boot. The man staggered back into a table. The scrape of steel on wood filled the air as he drew a blade from the table's top. Energy zipped through Jude. His body grew warm and then scorching hot. He gasped aloud as his veins burned with liquid fire. Each huff of breath formed chilly white clouds, as if he breathed the air of the coldest winter night. Jude staggered as he attempted to stay on his feet, his limbs at one moment heavy and then the next light as air. Dizziness gripped him even as a band tightened around his chest, stealing his breath. Keep your guard up. You swing a sword as if you never held one. Hydra barked. His breath heaved from the exertion, and his arms and legs burned. The blade in his hand felt as if it weighed 100 stones. Once he'd had great strength and could go for hours before resting when practicing swordplay. Now, his body betrayed him with its weakness. He squinted against the brightness of Hydra's light, the sight a reminder of what he'd lost. Something hit him in the back of the leg and he stumbled. Pay attention, Ramiel chastised. Your enemy will not fight with the honor in which you are accustomed. Humans are primitive in their principles and ideals when it comes to battle. They will attempt to overwhelm you with numbers to bring you down. If one is at your front, expect another at your back. He dared not glance at Ramiel either. Ramiel's soul's essence shone just as brightly as Hydra's, and currently he didn't have the energy to block the light from his sight. He took Ramiel's offered hand, alighting to his feet more slowly than when they had first started the day's training. Your soul hasn't changed. But your body is now that of a human. You have a man's senses. Learn them, use them to the best of your ability, or you'll be gutted at your first battle by a farm boy. He nodded, heeding Ramiel's counsel. The ice-covered ground crackled under his boot. With painstaking care he moved into position. Again, he panted. The wind whipped around them, the chill a balm to his overheated skin. Hydra. And Ramiel circled him just as they'd done when he was someone more than he was now. Your mind is as much of a weapon as your body. Hydra casually swung his blade with practiced ease. When your legs are like water, put some steel into them. When your arms are heavy or your grip slips, focus. Dig down deep to your core and brandish your resolve in order to make it through those final steps, that final swing. He dodged and rolled under Hydra's lunge, and brought his blade up to slice through Ramiel's staff. To survive, you must think like them. Be cunning and anticipate their next move, their motive, their intentions. Be ready with a counter of your own. He ducked when Ramiel attempted to rap him on the head with the end of his broken stave. Learn to fight dirty, he growled, punching Ramiel on the inside of the knee before knocking Ramiel in the chin with the pommel of his sword. Turning on his heel, he ducked low, sweeping his foot around. Hydra jumped, but staggered back. He pushed his remaining strength into his sword arm and smacked the flat of steel into Hydra's temple. Stunned, Hydra crumpled to the ground. His chest heaved as he gasped for breath. A man's body indeed, he thought derisively. Having such didn't make him weak. You want more, he taunted the two beings on the ground. Jude shook his head, throwing off the vision which caused his head to spin and the headache to worsen. Red laughed gleefully and swung the sword in a wide arc over his head, giving a war whoop that echoed about the room. The walls shimmered in ghostly images of Pictish warriors dressed only in their protective tattoos of blue woad joined red for battle. The phantoms smashed their weapons together, filling the room with ear-shattering clatter and roaring voices. When I'm done with you, boy, I will finish what the White Witch has started, and put the werewolves out of their misery. He grinned, the white of his eyes swallowed by black, and glistening blue fangs flashed as he gave Jude a harsh sneer. Swaying from dizziness, nausea roiled in Jude's belly, but he refused to fall to whatever strange illness gripped him. Nor would he allow this man to follow through with his threat. Over my dead body, Jude replied through gritted teeth. He met the crazed man in a ringing clash of swords. Each parry and thrust became easier, Jude's mind supplying technique and form. He'd never wielded a sword in his entire life, but with every swing of his arm his knowledge grew, until his body moved with unbroken action. He fought. As he battled the prick in a flurry of swordplay, the ghost warriors attacked, drawing Jude's blood. A force within his mind burned and flexed. Just as he'd pushed out the calming waves to Levi's pack, Jude now forced out a surge of searing energy. It rippled through the room, dissolving the illusion of the ghosts. Red screamed as if Jude had ripped something away from him. He pressed his attack, shoving Red back. The heckling light had left the man's countenance. Jude met Red's keen assessing gaze. Jude countered as his defenses and reflexes, his strength, and finally his mind was tested. You're the shaman, Jude gasped, swaying on his feet. The corners of Red's lips tipped up into an unhappy sneer. Yes. The sudden mental onslaught caused Jude's head to snap back. He lost his grip on the sword before he fell to his knees. He slammed up hastily constructed shields that the shaman smashed through effortlessly. Over and over he defended as the shaman confidently walked around him, clucking his tongue at Jude with each defeat. If living with Diego had taught him anything, it was that there would always be a way over an obstacle, and more than one way to win a fight. Diego had taught him to use any means necessary. When the smug asshole passed in front of him again, Jude launched forward on unsteady legs, crashing into the shaman and aiming his shoulder into the man's nuts. The mental attack stopped, freeing his mind. Red crumpled to the floor, hunched into a ball around his center. Jude rolled him over and straddled his chest, trapping the shaman's arms under his knees. Heaving for breath, Jude fisted a hand in the red hair, raising the shaman's head slightly before he knocked it back into the dark wood of the floor. The shaman blinked, gasping and appearing dazed. Pressing the palm of his free hand against the shaman's throat, Jude waited for the stunned expression to pass, and he had the shaman's undivided attention. Jude squeezed, cutting off some of the airway but not all. They are mine. They're my people, and so long as I live, none will harm them. Not even a crazy-ass shaman like you. Rage rode Jude. The injustice done to the werewolves, the passivity of the paranormal community. They all ignored the plight of a people, and he couldn't understand why. He refused to ignore the suffering of those who would be his family, a people who he'd started to care for. Jude, Tasha called from across the room. The soft inquiry brought him back from his rage-filled thoughts. Immediately, he rolled off the shaman and collapsed on the floor. The physical and mental strain from the fight had left him drained. He breathed heavily and glanced around the room they destroyed. The sword he'd pulled from the wicker basket glinted in the fluorescent light, beckoning to him until he crawled toward the blade, needing to reclaim it. "You've finally come back," the shaman panted. "You've allowed yourself to be reborn." Jude glanced back with an incredulous expression. The man's eyes were brilliant green again, his red hair tangled and wild. A grin of pure joy split his freckled face, seemingly out of place as the shaman lay among shattered furniture and broken stoneware. "You're one crazy motherfucker." "No, just lost. A druid turned shaman because his people abandoned him, just as the werewolves once abandoned you all those centuries ago." He wished he could say the shaman was out of his mind because he claimed to recognize Jude called him friend. "I think I'm the crazy one. I'm 20 years old with scattered memories of another person floating around inside my head, whose voice has been plaguing my dreams for a year." Jude's hand closed over the hilt of the sword. The buzz of electricity tingled against his skin. Now the two lives, his and the disjointed memories of another, were merging, and Jude wondered who he really was. A college student and brother to Beck, or some long-gone druid? The werewolves didn't abandon Sverd Ojiskjold shaman. They were murdered as they traveled. Their guard massacred, Tasha said, her voice barely loud enough to be heard. "Yes, yes," the shaman snapped, glaring at Tasha's tear-streaked face. The wolves were aware of the danger, and yet they couldn't keep the White Witch from taking what was supposed to be most precious to them. Now they serve him because they were blinded by his subterfuge. They had forgotten their enemy, one who remembered them well. Jude was confused. "What the hell are you talking about? What has Marks Barnabas stolen from the werewolves other than their families?" The shaman's eyes softened when his gaze returned to Jude. He wanted to squirm as the shaman scrutinized him, as if memorizing Jude's features. The druids once were the caretakers of more than the werewolf clans. The population was smaller back then and limited to certain areas. Once there was one among us who desired to soul share with the werewolves, to help wolfkind find balance between their two aspects. As the clans grew, the druid became their sword protector against the hunters and others who wanted to control the power the werewolves wielded. He took a wolf mate who became his shield. Together they were Sverd Ojiskjold. At one time, the creatures of the forests responded to the werewolf's call. It hasn't been like that for centuries. Not since. Jude rose to his feet, taking the sword with him. So Barnabas killed these two, leaving the werewolves vulnerable. The shaman sat up on the floor, making no move to rise to his feet. Cross his expression, hope battled despair. The witch did more than kill the Yelf. Magnus and his wolf mate Abigail. He spent weeks picking them apart. When I finally tracked down Yelf, I was too late. The witch had tortured Abigail in front of Yelf. My best friend died in my arms, mourning the loss of his wolfmate, hating himself for being unable to save Abigail. The shaman wiped at a single tear from his cheek. A deep bitterness aged his youthful countenance. "I'm sorry for the loss of your friend, but it does not excuse your actions or words." The shaman sighed. "I apologize for my tactics, but it was necessary to unlock your knowledge. It would have taken years of study, but you don't have that luxury, so I attacked that which you'd instinctively protect. I may harbor anger against them for their failure, but I don't wish them harm." Jude knelt on one knee, leaning heavily on the sword. "Are you saying you intentionally picked a fight with me?" "Dude, I'm not. I don't know who I am right now, much less a druid." The shaman's bright gaze pierced Jude. "You were born a druid with the druids' knowledge already contained within you. Haven't you wondered why it is you see or sense things about people? Haven't you noticed how some individuals shine or that you're able to feel the emotions of others. Hasn't the wind spoken to you but you don't understand what it's saying? These are all cracks in the walls holding your knowledge, and this is the information leaking through. Jude shook his head, afraid to believe, even though everything the shaman said rang true. He'd spent his teenage years being told what he saw was a figment of his imagination. He'd lied to his therapist and to his parents in order to keep from being given medication. He'd spent the last year keeping the voice he heard a secret because he was afraid he really was insane. He was leery of the relief he wanted to feel, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Since Diego and his brother had shown him the paranormal world, Jude had understood that it existed, but he wasn't a part of it, standing outside and occasionally looking in whenever he recognized an other on the street. Now he was in the middle, not as a human or even an enhanced human like Beck, but if the shaman was to be believed, as a member of the strange world he barely even comprehended. The shaman nodded towards the blade in Jude's grip. The sword you now hold has been in my possession since Angel died. I had the basket made specifically to hold the sword, waiting for you to come back. The longer I waited, the more cluttered the basket became. All anyone has seen was the cane or umbrella until you stepped through the door. What you hold is named Johil. With that one word, Jude's body felt as if it had been plucked like a harp's string. To his astonishment, the sword gave voice and repeated the word to Jude with glee. The shaman continued. All of us have a foci made specifically for the druid, and the device can only be wielded by the one druid. Welcome back, my friend. I have sorely missed you. The shaman smiled softly at Jude. Jude was too tired to argue. There were so many questions and not enough answers being given. He snorted softly. Druid. Was he really supposed to believe the sword recognized him, was made specifically for him? Would it be so terrible if he was what the shaman claimed? Could he use this newfound part of himself to help the werewolves? Could he trust himself or the shaman, who called him friend and was obviously overjoyed to see him? At one time, had he truly been a champion of the werewolves? The memories of battles that were unlocked while he'd fought with the shaman were fuzzy and disjointed, but he did remember another time, if the details of the recollections were any indication. Jude closed his eyes, recalling the dream he'd had last night. He could see the light of the full moon through the treetops of the forest as he ran, the werewolves at his side baying at the sky with wolf song. His dream self had been happy and self-assured, knowing who and what his purpose was. He'd moved with confidence because he'd known what he was capable of. He had believed so many things with heart and conviction. Was the dream like so many others? A memory, a glimpse at someone he used to be? Was that dissimilar person really him? Could he be that person again? Did he want to? Would he lose his identity? Or would the disjointed parts of himself merge fluidly, coming together as two parts of a whole? So many questions, and the only thing he knew in that moment, he was scared. Rising fully to his feet, he slowly made his way through the debris toward a wide-eyed Tasha. The shaman followed him, seemingly not realizing Jude wanted to be done with the conversation. We didn't abandon the werewolves, Jude. We did the best we could to protect them from Barnabas. But then we druids started to disappear. You're the only one to ever die, and even then you didn't die but simply left your body. With the druids vanishing and knowing they have to be somewhere out there, possibly being held by that abomination, the rest of us went into hiding. Jude leaned against a wooden pillar. From what I've overheard from Diego, the druids, your friends, are probably dead. You're not listening to me. Druids don't die, Jude. You're not making sense, Neil. If what you say is true, then sometime in the past I died once. The shaman beamed a brilliant smile, and Jude realized what he'd said, plucking the man's name out of the air. When Jude looked at Neil, he knew without a doubt the man hadn't physically changed and had lived far longer than any would be able to guess. We druids aren't human. We're immortal. In your grief you pulled your soul out of your body. You didn't die because you couldn't. It's impossible. Don't know why you came back. I'm only glad you did. I don't want to believe you. Jude's reluctance wavered, falling under the sheer amount of evidence given to him. He put a name to a person he didn't even know. He'd fought with a sword as if he'd been doing so all his life. All of this was true. Then everything he'd struggled with was the result of the mental walls coming down, releasing the information from another lifetime. Just as Neil said, it would mean Jude wasn't human. Did his parents know? Was that why they had barely tolerated him? What would Beck say? The sword sung in his grip. Holding the blade felt like he'd been reunited with a piece of himself. The weight of it, how the hilt fit precisely in his hand, and the power pulsing in time to his heartbeat, all of it felt right. He'd discerned the colorful auras of the paranormals, felt the werewolf emotions, and heard the whispers in the wind, seen what he'd come to think of as Beck's in Diego's starlight. Where are your people, Neil? Jude gathered the courage to glance at the person who called him friend. Ghosts of the dead, the Pictish warriors from before returned. They hovered around Neil, whose expression turned morose. Gone, my people are no more. Green eyes held Jude's gaze, allowing him to see how lost and alone Neil had been. No, they're not gone. They're still with you, even if you refuse to see them. Jude crossed the room to Neil and helped him to his feet. Jude placed his palm on Neil's shoulder, and the phantoms mimicked him, stacking their hands on top of his. Neil shivered. Maybe your purpose has changed, Jude suggested. Before he stepped away, Neil trapped Jude's hand. I'm glad you haven't forgotten everything. Well, it's freaking the hell out of me, Jude responded with heartfelt honesty. In time, hopefully, you'll come to understand and accept what you know. Neil paused, wetting his lips. We've continued to search for a way to free your werewolves. We've been hoping to devise a plan to sneak the mates out. But the guardian who watches over the prisoners, none can find a way to get around him, and he is impossible for us to kill. You know where I can find the mates? Jude asked excitedly, shoving away the confusion of his thoughts and unwanted information. He was relieved to have something else to concentrate on that he could push to the forefront. He struggled with how to deal with what just happened. The werewolves and their mates would come first. Later he would decide what he would do with this new view of himself. For now, at least. They're scheduled to be moved in 5 days. The crow has been watching them. Neil moved to a table and grabbed a scabbard, giving it to Jude. When Jude grasped the carved leather, Neil held on firmly until Jude met his gaze. The guardian. Jude interrupted. I understand, Neil. The guardian is an obstacle I must overcome. I will find a way. Can you find a way past a bound Nephilim? Neil asked, releasing his hold on the